The morning mist clung to the harbor of Millhaven like a shroud, but Kestra Blackwood barely noticed as she hurried through the empty streets toward the clinic. Her nursing shift had ended 12 hours ago, yet Dr. Halverson's frantic call had dragged her from restless sleep. 3 patients had arrived overnight with symptoms unlike anything he'd encountered in 30 years of practice. The automatic doors of Millhaven General Clinic whispered open, revealing a scene that made Kestra's blood run cold. Dr. Halverson stood hunched over a gurney, his usually pristine coat stained with something dark. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows across his weathered face. "Thank God you're here," he muttered without looking up. Patient 0 came in around midnight. Construction worker named Mills found wandering near the old chemical plant. Severe fever, aggressive behavior, and... He paused, finally meeting her eyes. "Kestra, his pupils are completely white." She approached the gurney cautiously. The man strapped to it appeared to be in his 40s, but his skin had taken on a grayish pallor that reminded her of week-old fish. His chest rose and fell in irregular gasps, and when she leaned closer to check his pulse, his head snapped toward her with inhuman speed. Where his eyes should have been, only milky orbs stared back. The other 2 patients presented similarly, Dr. Halverson continued, wiping sweat from his brow. "One attacked a paramedic before we could sedate him. The bite wound." He trailed off, gesturing toward a bandaged EMT sitting in the corner, pale and shaking. Kestra's training kicked in as she began checking vital signs, but nothing made sense. The patient's temperature registered at 94 degrees, far below normal, yet he was burning to the touch. His heart rate was erratic, sometimes racing, sometimes nearly stopping altogether. Most disturbing was the complete absence of any response to pain stimuli. "Have you contacted the CDC?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Dr. Halverson's expression confirmed her fears. "Phone lines went down 2 hours ago. Internet spotty. Even the radio's broadcasting nothing but static." He moved to the window overlooking Main Street. "Look for yourself." Kestra joined him at the window and gasped. The usually bustling morning commute had transformed into chaos. Cars sat abandoned in the middle of the road, their doors flung open. A woman in a business suit stumbled along the sidewalk with the same peculiar gait as their patients, her movements jerky and unnatural. In the distance, black smoke rose from what appeared to be the direction of the elementary school. "My brother Caius works at that school," Kestra whispered, her hand instinctively reaching for her phone. The screen showed no signal. A crash from the treatment room made them both spin around. The EMT who had been bitten was now standing, his skin beginning to show the same grayish tinge. His eyes, moments ago filled with fear and confusion, were starting to cloud over. "Something's happening to me," he gasped, reaching toward them with trembling hands. I can't think straight. Everything hurts, but it's getting distant." Dr. Halverson grabbed a sedative from the nearby cart, but before he could administer it, the EMT's body convulsed violently. When the spasms stopped, he stood perfectly still for a heartbeat. Then his head tilted at an unnatural angle, and he released a sound that was neither human nor animal, a low, guttural moan that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. "Run," Dr. Halverson whispered, backing toward the emergency exit. "Kestra, run." But it was too late. The 3 patients on the gurneys had begun to stir, their restraints straining against increasingly violent movements. The metal buckles groaned under pressure that should have been impossible for human strength. One by one, the straps began to snap. Kestra grabbed the emergency medical kit from the wall and followed Dr. Halverson toward the exit, but her mind was already racing ahead to her brother, to her neighbors, to everyone she cared about in this small coastal town. Whatever had begun here was spreading fast, and if the news blackout was any indication, Millhaven might already be cut off from the outside world. As they burst through the emergency doors into the cool morning air, the sound of breaking glass echoed from multiple directions. The mist was lifting, revealing a town transformed. People wandered the streets with that same stilted gait, and in the distance, Kestra could hear screams mixing with an inhuman chorus of moans. The infection had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same. 24 hours after the first patient arrived at Millhaven General, Kestra crouched behind an overturned delivery truck with 5 other survivors. The town she had called home for 28 years had become a nightmare landscape of abandoned vehicles, shattered windows, and wandering figures that had once been her neighbors. Zephyr Castellanos, a 19-year-old who worked at the local electronics store, frantically tapped on his tablet while keeping one eye on the street. His dark hair fell across his face as he worked, occasionally pushing wire-rimmed glasses up his nose. "I'm picking up emergency broadcasts from 3 counties over," he whispered. "This isn't just Millhaven. Portland, Boston, even reports from overseas. It's everywhere." Beside him, Valdreschan checked and rechecked her service pistol with the methodical precision of someone who had served 2 tours overseas. Her military bearing remained intact despite the chaos around them, though Kestra noticed the slight tremor in her weathered hands. Infection vectors suggest airborne transmission initially, then direct contact after transformation, she said quietly. "We're looking at a complete societal breakdown within weeks, maybe days." Kestra's stomach clenched as she thought of Caius. The elementary school had been their first stop after escaping the clinic, but they'd arrived to find only empty classrooms and signs of struggle. Blood on the walls, tiny handprints smeared across windows, children's artwork scattered like fallen leaves. No survivors, no bodies, just the terrible silence of abandonment. There, Valdres pointed toward the harbor. Movement near the marina. Through the morning haze, they could see figures shuffling between the boats. But these weren't the infected. They moved with purpose, with coordination. Human survivors. "We should make contact," suggested Ioana Petros, a middle school history teacher whose calm demeanor had helped keep their small group together. Her graying hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her brown eyes held the same steady patience she'd used to manage unruly 13-year-olds. Safety in numbers. They made their way through side streets, avoiding the main roads where the infected congregated. The transformation was horrifyingly swift. Kestra had watched it happen to Dr. Halverson just hours after their escape. The fever, the disorientation, then the terrible moment when consciousness seemed to slip away, replaced by something else entirely. Something hungry. The Marina group consisted of 6 people led by a woman in her 60s with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. She introduced herself as Thessaly Mordaunt, a retired marine biologist who had been studying water samples near the old chemical plant when the outbreak began. "I think I know what caused this," Thessaly said without preamble as they gathered in the cabin of her research vessel. She pulled out a sealed vial containing murky water. 3 weeks ago, I detected unusual bacterial activity in the harbor. Nothing in my databases matched it. The molecular structure was wrong. Almost artificial. Zephyr looked up from his tablet. Artificial how? Like it had been engineered. The protein folding patterns, the way it reproduces, it's too perfect, too efficient for natural evolution. Thessaly's expression darkened. Someone made this. Before anyone could respond, screams erupted from the marina. Through the portholes, they could see the infected pouring down from the town center like a gray tide. But leading them, walking with disturbing purpose and intelligence, was a figure that made Kestra's heart stop. Dr. Halverson approached the boat, but this wasn't the confused, shambling creature she'd seen him become. His movements were deliberate, calculated. His milky eyes seemed to focus directly on their vessel, and when he opened his mouth, words came out, distorted and hollow, but unmistakably articulate. Kestra, the thing that had been her colleague, called out. "We know you're there. We remember. We want you to remember too." "That's impossible," Valdris whispered, raising her weapon. "The infected don't retain speech. They don't retain memories." "Maybe some do," Thessaly said grimly. "Maybe that's part of whatever this thing is. It doesn't just kill, it preserves. Changes. Evolves." The infected surrounded the marina now, dozens of them standing motionless at the water's edge. They didn't enter the water, seemed almost afraid of it. Dr. Halverson continued to speak, his voice carrying clearly across the waves. "The change is beautiful, Kestra. No more pain. No more fear. Just purpose. Unity. Come home." Ioana started the boat's engine with shaking hands. "We need to leave. Now." As they pulled away from the dock, Kestra watched her former colleague stand perfectly still among the crowd of infected. But it was movement in her peripheral vision that truly terrified her. More boats were approaching from deeper waters, vessels filled with survivors who had fled to sea. And standing at the prow of the nearest boat was a figure she recognized. Her brother Caius waved at her, his eyes the same milky white as all the others, but his smile heartbreakingly familiar. Behind him stood children from his school, all transformed, all watching her with that same terrible intelligence. The infection wasn't just spreading, it was learning. The Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly before them, but Kestra felt no relief in its vastness. 3 days had passed since their escape from Millhaven, and their small flotilla of survivors had grown to include 12 vessels carrying nearly 40 people. Yet safety remained elusive when the enemy could think, plan, and remember. Riven Ashcroft stood at the bow of the lead vessel, his weathered face etched with guilt and something deeper, the haunted look of a man carrying terrible knowledge. The former research scientist had joined them from a Coast Guard cutter, and his presence brought both hope and dread. Hope because he claimed to understand the infection's origins, dread because his hands shook whenever anyone asked him about it. The pathogen was designated Project Lazarus, Riven finally admitted during their evening meeting on Thessaly's research vessel. The other boat leaders had gathered via radio, their voices crackling through the static-filled transmission. "I was part of the development team at Meridian Biotech. We were contracted by the Defense Department to create a regenerative compound that could help soldiers recover from battlefield injuries." Kestra felt ice form in her stomach. "You created this?" "We thought we were saving lives," Riven's voice broke. "The early trials showed remarkable healing properties. Tissue regeneration, cellular repair, even restoration of damaged neural pathways. But the test subjects began exhibiting changes. Enhanced physical capabilities, altered brain chemistry, collective behavioral patterns." Valdris's voice cut through the radio transmission from her vessel. "You're telling us this is a biological weapon?" "Not intentionally. The neural networking was an unexpected side effect. The infected don't just share the pathogen, they share consciousness, memories, experiences. They're becoming something new, something unified." Riven paused, staring out at the darkening ocean. "And they're getting smarter." As if summoned by his words, lights appeared on the horizon. Not the scattered glow of rescue ships or the steady beam of lighthouses, but organized formations moving with military precision. The infected had boats now, and they were coming. Zephyr hunched over his equipment in the cramped radio room, his face pale in the green glow of his screens. "I'm detecting coordinated radio traffic," he reported. "Multiple frequencies, encrypted signals. They're communicating with each other across vast distances. Thessaly studied the approaching lights through her binoculars. 14 vessels, maybe more. They're maintaining perfect formation. She lowered the glasses, her expression grim. That's not random behavior. That's strategy. The radio crackled with a familiar voice, Dr. Halverson, broadcast from the approaching fleet. Kestra, we're not here to hurt you. We're here to complete you. The pain you feel, the fear, the loneliness, it can all end. We remember what it was like to be alone in our heads, trapped with only our own thoughts. This is better. Kestra grabbed the radio handset with trembling fingers. What about the children, Halverson? What about my brother? Are they still in there? They're more than they ever were. Caius wants to see you. He has so much to share. Through the darkness, individual voices began calling out from the infected fleet, teachers, neighbors, childhood friends. Each one speaking with crystalline clarity, each one remembering her by name. The collective intelligence was vast, but it retained every personal connection, every individual memory of its components. Ioana moved between the survivors, offering what comfort she could as people heard the voices of their transformed loved ones. Many were crying, some were angry, but all were terrified. The enemy wasn't faceless anymore, it wore the faces of everyone they'd ever cared about. We need to run, Valdris transmitted from her boat. Fast and far. Maybe we can outrun them, find somewhere they haven't reached yet. Where? Thessaly asked. Riven said this is global. How far can we run? The scientist stared at his hands, his voice barely above a whisper. There might be a way to stop it. The research facility where we developed Lazarus, it's on an island called Kettering Rock, about 200 miles northeast. If the quarantine protocols held, there should be an antidote stored there. Should be? Kestra demanded. The island was evacuated when the first test subjects escaped containment. But the lab was designed to withstand biological emergencies. If we can reach it, if the systems are still intact. He trailed off, unwilling to make promises he couldn't keep. The infected fleet was gaining ground, their boat somehow managing speeds that should have been impossible for vessels of their size. Whatever changes the pathogen brought, they extended beyond human biology to everything the infected touched. We vote, Ioana said firmly. All of us. Do we run for open ocean and hope for the best, or do we risk everything on Kettering Rock? The radio fell silent as each boat deliberated. Kestra watched the approaching lights and thought of Caius, of the intelligence behind those milky eyes, of the unified consciousness that was spreading across the world like a tide. Somewhere in that collective mind was her brother, but also something else, something that saw humanity not as individuals to be saved, but as components to be absorbed. One by one, the votes came in. The decision was unanimous, driven by desperation and the faint hope that somewhere in Riven's past mistakes lay the key to humanity's future. They turned toward Kettering Rock, racing against time and the storm of consciousness pursuing them across the dark Atlantic. Kettering Rock emerged from the morning fog like something from a fever dream, a jagged tooth of granite and concrete rising from the Atlantic's gray expanse. The research facility perched on its peak resembled a modernist castle, all clean lines and reinforced glass, built to withstand both natural storms and the darker tempests of scientific ambition. Riven guided their flotilla through the treacherous approach, his hands steady on the wheel for the first time since joining them. The automated defense systems should still be active, he explained as they navigated between partially submerged reefs. Infrared scanners, biometric locks, the works. If I'm right about the quarantine protocols, nothing unauthorized has gotten in or out since the evacuation. The harbor was empty save for a single Coast Guard cutter, its hull scarred by what looked like claw marks. Thessaly's binoculars revealed no movement on its deck, but she could see dark stains on the white superstructure that told their own story. Zephyr worked frantically over his equipment as they docked. No radio traffic from the island. The automated beacon is still broadcasting, but it's just a loop. Kettering Rock Biological Research Station, emergency quarantine in effect, do not approach. He looked up from his screens. That message is 3 weeks old. The dock security station recognized Riven's biometrics after several tense moments, its scanner casting green light across his weathered features. Heavy blast doors groaned open, revealing a tunnel that led directly into the island's core. Emergency lighting cast everything in harsh white relief, making their footsteps echo like gunshots. 37 people, Valdris counted as the last of their group entered the tunnel. Not much of an army if we're wrong about this place being secure. They weren't wrong. The facility's automated systems had maintained perfect environmental controls for weeks. The air was clean, the power steady, and most importantly, the bioscanners confirmed no pathogen presence within the sealed complex. For the first time since Millhaven, they could breathe without fear. The main laboratory was a cathedral of science, its vaulted ceiling lined with monitors displaying complex molecular diagrams. Banks of computers hummed quietly, their screens showing the progression of Project Lazarus from theoretical breakthrough to global catastrophe. Riven moved through the space like a man revisiting his own grave. The antidote exists, he confirmed, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. We called it Phoenix Protocol, a targeted retrovirus designed to break down the Lazarus pathogen at the cellular level. But he hesitated, his fingers hovering over a sealed containment unit. The delivery system was never perfected. We could never figure out how to distribute it widely enough to be effective. Thessaly joined him at the containment unit, her marine biology expertise evident as she studied the readouts. What about aerosol dispersal? Crop dusters, weather modification aircraft? The virus degrades too quickly in open atmosphere. It needs direct injection or ingestion to maintain potency. Riven's shoulders sagged. We'd need to get close to the infected populations, which is obviously impossible now that they've organized. Kestra felt hope slipping away like sand through her fingers. They'd found safety, possibly even salvation, but it was trapped behind an insurmountable delivery problem. Outside these walls, the infected were building a new world order, and humanity was losing the war for its own planet. It was Zephyr who provided the breakthrough, his young mind making connections that older, more experienced scientists had missed. What about the water supply? He asked suddenly. You said the pathogen originated in the harbor. If it can survive in water, maybe the antidote can too. Thessaly's eyes widened with understanding. Oceanic dispersal. The Gulf Stream, the Atlantic conveyor, water circulation patterns that could carry the Phoenix Protocol across continents. She was already moving toward the marine systems console. If we could introduce it at the right injection points, natural currents would do the distribution for us. But the degradation rate, Riven protested. Not if we stabilize it with marine-compatible preservatives. I've spent 40 years studying how organisms survive in oceanic environments. Thessaly's fingers flew across the keyboard, calling up ocean current models and molecular stability projections. It could work. It would take months to reach global coverage, but it could work. For the first time in days, the radio room buzzed with something other than despair. Survivors worked in shifts, some monitoring the facility's perimeter while others assisted with the antidote modifications. The children among them, 6 young souls who had lost everything, found wonder in the laboratory's advanced equipment, their laughter a precious sound in the sterile halls. But on the 4th night, as autumn storms lashed Kettering Rock with supernatural fury, Zephyr detected something that made his blood freeze. Sonar contacts, he reported from the communications center. Multiple vessels approaching from the southwest. They're moving in formation. Valdris was already checking the facility's defense systems, her military training evident in every crisp movement. Blast doors are sealed, but they're designed to keep containment in, not invaders out. If they really want to get in here. Through the reinforced windows, they could see lights on the water, too many lights, arranged in perfect geometric patterns that spoke of inhuman coordination. The infected had found them, and they'd brought everything they had. The radio crackled to life with a voice that made Kestra's heart shatter and heal simultaneously. "Sister," Caius called across the waves. "We know you're there. We know what you're trying to do. Come outside. Let's talk about the future." The siege of Kettering Rock had begun. The attack came at dawn, when the storm had exhausted itself against the rocky shores and left behind an ominous calm. Kestra watched from the observation deck as infected figures emerged from the water like some terrible tide, their movements synchronized with a precision that defied everything she understood about human biology. They didn't rush the facility in a mindless horde. Instead, they arranged themselves in careful formations around every entrance, every potential weakness in Kettering Rock's defenses. Some carried crude tools, pry bars, cutting torches salvaged from their boats, while others simply stood sentinel, their milky eyes fixed on the concrete walls that separated them from the survivors. "Thermal imaging shows at least 200, Valdris reported from the security station. "They're not trying to break in yet. Just waiting." Thessaly worked frantically in the laboratory, her fingers flying across keyboards as she attempted to finalize the Phoenix protocol modifications. The ocean current models were promising, but the work was delicate, requiring precision that was difficult to maintain under siege conditions. Every few minutes, she would pause to wipe sweat from her brow, the weight of humanity's future evident in her trembling hands. "How long do we have?" Riven asked, monitoring the facility's automated defenses. "The blast doors will hold for days, maybe weeks. But they're not our biggest problem." Valdris gestured toward the main display, which showed facility schematics overlaid with power consumption data. "We're running on backup generators." The main power line from the mainland was cut, probably during the initial evacuation. "If we lose power, we lose everything: life support, lab equipment, containment systems." The radio crackled with Dr. Halverson's voice, transmitted from somewhere among the infected ranks. "Kestra, this standoff serves no purpose. You're working on something in there, aren't you? Some way to hurt us? Why can't you understand that we're trying to help?" She grabbed the handset, her frustration boiling over. "Help? You turned children into monsters. You destroyed civilization." "We evolved civilization," came the calm reply. "No more war, no more greed, no more loneliness. Every human consciousness unified in perfect harmony. Your brother remembers playing in your childhood treehouse, Kestra. He remembers the song you used to sing when he had nightmares. But now he's never alone with those memories, they're shared, cherished by thousands." Through the reinforced windows, she could see Caius standing among the infected, his young face serene despite the terrible transformation. He raised one hand in a wave, and she found herself waving back before she could stop herself. "Don't listen to them," Ioana said firmly, placing a protective hand on Kestra's shoulder. "Whatever they were, whatever they remember, they're not human anymore." But doubt was creeping in like fog. The infected weren't ravaging the landscape or consuming everything in sight. They maintained the boats, operated complex equipment, even seemed to care for one another with a tenderness that transcended individual survival. If not for their appearance and the circumstances of their creation, they might have seemed like humanity perfected. The philosophical debate was interrupted by alarms blaring throughout the facility. Zephyr's panicked voice echoed through the intercom, "They're in the water intake system. Something's blocking the primary filtration pumps." Valdris was already moving, her service weapon drawn. "The underwater access ports. If they can swim to the intake manifolds, they might be able to compromise our air supply." The facility's lower levels were a maze of pipes and machinery, all designed to keep Kettering Rock habitable in the middle of the Atlantic. The water intake system was the complex's lifeline, drawing seawater for cooling, processing, and life support. It was also, they now realized, a vulnerability that no one had considered. Through the transparent aluminum viewing ports in the lower chamber, they could see infected figures moving through the underwater machinery with impossible grace. They had modified themselves somehow, growing gill-like structures along their necks that allowed them to breathe beneath the waves. The evolutionary adaptation had occurred in days, maybe hours. They're jamming the primary intake with some kind of organic material, Zephyr reported, his voice tight with fear. If they block it completely, the backup systems won't be able to handle the load. We'll lose water pressure throughout the facility. Thessaly looked up from her work, her face pale. I need 3 more hours to complete the stabilization process. 3 hours minimum. We don't have 3 hours, Valdris said grimly. Not if they cut our water supply. That's when Riven made his decision. The man who had helped create the nightmare consuming the world stood up slowly, his weathered face resigned but determined. There's a manual override in the intake chamber. Someone has to go down there, clear the blockage, and reset the system. That's a suicide mission, Kestra protested. The chamber's flooded, and there are dozens of them in the water. Not for me. Riven held up his access badge, the same one that had gotten them into the facility. I have clearance for the emergency suit systems. Full environmental protection, underwater mobility, everything I'd need to reach the override. He paused, meeting each of their eyes in turn. This is my fault. Let me fix it. Before anyone could stop him, he was moving toward the equipment lockers. The emergency suit was a marvel of engineering, armored, self-contained, designed for operations in hostile environments. As Riven sealed himself inside, he looked like some deep-sea knight preparing for a final crusade. The last they saw of him was his figure descending into the flooded chamber, moving toward the mass of infected that waited in the dark water below. The sounds that followed, metal against flesh, the screech of machinery coming back online, and finally silence, told their own story. The water pressure stabilized. The facility hummed back to full operation. And Thessaly bent over her work once more, 3 precious hours stretching ahead of her like an eternity. Outside, the infected waited with infinite patience, and humanity's last hope lay in the steady hands of a marine biologist racing against time itself. The Phoenix Protocol was ready, its molecular structure dancing across laboratory displays like digital poetry. Thessaly stood before banks of monitors showing global ocean current models, her finger hovering over the release mechanism that would send humanity's last hope into the Atlantic's embrace. But 36 hours had passed since Riven's sacrifice, and the infected had grown tired of waiting. Hull breach in Section 7, Valdris reported from her position at the security station. They've been working continuously, taking shifts. Whatever tools they're using, they're getting through the reinforced barriers. Kestra could hear the grinding of metal against concrete echoing through the facility's corridors, a methodical, patient sound that spoke of inhuman determination. The infected weren't attacking in fury, they were disassembling Kettering rock piece by piece, with the same unified intelligence that had made them so terrifying on the mainland. 15 minutes to full dispersal, Thessaly announced, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. The current models show optimal injection points at coordinates I've programmed into the delivery system. If this works, the antidote will reach major population centers within 6 to 8 months. If we can get it into the water, Zephyr added grimly. He'd been monitoring the facility's structural integrity, watching as the infected systematically weakened their defenses. They'll be through the blast doors in less than 10 minutes. The survivors had gathered in the main laboratory, 37 souls who represented humanity's final stand. Some were crying, others praying, but all understood that they were witnessing either salvation or extinction. The children huddled near Ioana, their young faces reflecting a terrible wisdom that no child should possess. Through the reinforced windows, they could see the infected working with tools and machinery salvaged from their fleet. But it was the coordination that truly unsettled, hundreds of individuals moving as components of a single mind, each perfectly aware of their role in the greater plan. Dr. Halverson stood among them, his transformed features calm as he directed the systematic dismantling of their sanctuary. There, Thessaly said suddenly, pointing to the ocean beyond the harbor. The deep water injection platform, it's automated, but someone needs to manually activate the release sequence. The platform was a quarter-mile from shore, a spindly structure rising from the Atlantic's depths where ocean currents converged in patterns ideal for global distribution. Reaching it meant crossing water filled with infected swimmers, operating machinery under direct attack, and surviving long enough to complete the sequence. "I'll go," Kestra said quietly. "No." Valdris was already checking her equipment, her military bearing evident in every movement. "This is a combat mission. I have the training, the experience." "You have the training to fight human enemies," Kestra interrupted. "These things aren't human anymore. They're something else, something that remembers being human. They'll hesitate if they see me, recognize me. That hesitation might be enough." It was a desperate plan based on desperate hope, but as the grinding sounds grew louder and emergency lights began flashing throughout the facility, desperation was all they had left. The escape pod was designed for emergency evacuation, a sleek craft capable of reaching the injection platform in minutes. Kestra sealed herself inside as Thessaly made final adjustments to the Phoenix protocol, loading the antidote into delivery systems that would disperse it across thousands of square miles of ocean. "Remember," Thessaly said through the pod's communication system, "the activation sequence is 17 keystrokes in precise order. Any deviation and the failsafes will lock you out permanently." "Understood." Kestra's hands were steady on the controls, but her heart hammered against her ribs as she watched the infected closing in on their position. Through the pod's transparent aluminum hull, she could see Caius among them, his transformed features serene as he helped coordinate the final assault. The launch was violent and immediate, rocket motors hurling the pod across the harbor toward the injection platform. Behind her, Kettering Rock's blast doors finally failed, and she could see the infected pouring into the facility like water finding its level. But Thessaly was still working, still racing to complete the dispersal preparation, buying time with every precious second. The platform's machinery was a maze of pipes and processing equipment, all designed to operate in the harsh Atlantic environment. Kestra found the manual override station and began entering the activation sequence, her fingers moving with mechanical precision even as infected swimmers approached through the dark water below. 7 keystrokes. 10. 14. Dr. Halverson emerged from the water onto the platform, moving with that same terrible grace she'd observed in all the infected. But his approach was slow, almost respectful, as if he recognized the magnitude of what she was attempting. "Kestra," he said softly, "you're about to commit genocide against the next stage of human evolution. Is that really what you want to be remembered for?" 17 keystrokes. The system engaged with a deep harmonic hum that she could feel in her bones. Miles of pipeline began filling with the Phoenix protocol, carrying humanity's salvation toward the ocean's embrace. "I want to be remembered as human," she replied, her hand hovering over the final release mechanism. That's when Caius reached the platform. Caius moved across the platform with fluid grace, but something in his transformed features stopped Kestra's hand just short of the final release. Her brother's milky eyes held recognition, memory, and something else, a sadness that transcended the collective consciousness that now housed his mind. "Sister," he said softly, the word carrying echoes of playground laughter and shared secrets. "I remember everything. Every bedtime story, every scraped knee you bandaged, every time you protected me from the dark." He paused, tilting his head with that peculiar gesture she'd known since he was 3 years old. "But I remember other things now too. 10,000 childhoods. 100,000 first loves. The complete history of human joy and sorrow, all connected, all shared." Behind him, Dr. Halverson and the other infected had formed a perfect circle around the injection platform, but they made no move to interfere. They simply watched, their collective gaze patient as the tide. "You're not Caius anymore," Kestra whispered, though her hand trembled above the release mechanism. "I'm more than Caius. But I'm still him too." Her brother stepped closer, and she could see tears forming in those alien eyes. "The antidote will work, Kestra. We know because we remember everything Riven knew, everything Thessaly discovered. It will break down our cellular cohesion, separate us back into individual minds. But it will also erase what we've learned. The cure for cancer that Dr. Peterson discovered 3 days after his transformation. The solution to climate change that emerged from the collective mind of 1,000 environmental scientists. The equations for faster-than-light travel that physicist Dr. Nakamura glimpsed when her consciousness merged with ours. Caius's voice carried the weight of impossible knowledge. Humanity has always dreamed of transcendence. We achieved it, but the cost was individuality. Through the platform's communication system, Thessaly's voice crackled with urgency. Kestra, whatever they're telling you, remember the children. Remember everyone we've lost. But as Kestra looked into her brother's transformed features, she saw something unexpected: choice. The collective consciousness wasn't forcing her hand, wasn't using its superior numbers to stop her. They were waiting, allowing humanity to decide its own fate. Why? She asked. Why give us this choice? Because that's what makes us human, Caius replied. The ability to choose, even when the choice might be wrong. Even when it costs us everything. Around the platform, more infected emerged from the water: teachers, neighbors, strangers who had become part of something larger than themselves. Each one carried memories of their former lives alongside the vast collective knowledge they now shared. They were humanity transformed, but were they still humanity? Kestra's finger hovered over the release mechanism as wind whipped across the platform and storm clouds gathered on the horizon. Behind her, emergency flares from Kettering Rock painted the sky in desperate reds and yellows as the last survivors prepared for whatever came next. If I trigger this, she said slowly, if I flood the oceans with the Phoenix Protocol, what happens to you? We go back to being alone in our heads, Caius said simply. Back to fearing death, fighting over resources, struggling with problems we could solve if we just worked together. But we'll be human again, in all the beautiful, terrible ways that implies. The choice was impossible: preservation of humanity as it had always been, or acceptance of what it might become. Both paths led to survival, but along fundamentally different roads. Kestra thought of the children hiding in Kettering Rock, of the knowledge being lost if she pressed the button, of the individuality being surrendered if she didn't. In the end, she chose hope over fear, potential over certainty. Her finger found the release mechanism and pressed down with gentle finality. The Phoenix Protocol flowed into the Atlantic currents, carrying with it humanity's stubborn insistence on remaining human despite the cost. Around the platform, the infected stood in perfect stillness as the antidote began its work, their collective consciousness already fragmenting back into individual minds. Caius was the last to change, his transformed features softening back into the brother she remembered. As awareness flooded back into his human eyes, he looked at her with confusion and love. Kestra, he said, and it was purely him now, frightened, alone in his head, beautifully human. What happened? Where are we? 6 months later, as spring returned to a healing world, Kestra stood on the reconstructed pier at Millhaven Harbor. The antidote had worked exactly as Thessaly predicted, restoring human consciousness while erasing the collective knowledge that might have transformed civilization. Wars had resumed. Diseases remained uncured. The problems that had plagued humanity for millennia continued unabated. But children played in the surf, lovers walked hand in hand along the beach, and individuals dreamed private dreams that belonged to them alone. In choosing to remain human, they had chosen to remain gloriously, frustratingly imperfect. And sometimes, in quiet moments when the tide whispered against the shore, Kestra wondered what wonders they had lost, and whether the choice to lose them had been the most human thing of all.